thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here with us today. And sorry for the glitches in the technology. Sometimes it happens. So I'll start all over. For those who were not with us at the beginning, we have two amazing speakers and the third one on the way. And with us at the moment, Stephanie Anderson, who is Professor of International Relations and Head of the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at the University of Wyoming, and did her PhD in Oxford and Cambridge. Sorry. And Angela Liberatore, who is Head of Research at the European Research Council and actually did her PhD at my alma mater, the European University Institute. And with no further ado, Steph, to you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm so sorry about the computer glitches. What I was beginning to say is that there's been a lot of sexism documented in women in academia, and which causes them troubles when it comes to promotion. And I'm just going to talk about them in general, and then I talk about some of my experiences. So one issue, especially in the United States, are teaching evaluations. In general, white men get better teaching evaluations than minorities or women. And part of the issue with women is that they can be seen as not as competent, they can be seen as arrogant. If they think that they're sort of out of their place and they're lecturing, they're also often dinged for not being nurturing enough, perhaps not dressing the way someone thinks a woman should be dressing. And so all of those make it more difficult for women to get good teaching evaluations. Also at work, women are asked to do more service than men. In general, that women say yes more than men. Men are more likely to say no. And this means that women don't have the same sort of research portfolio that men do. Another issue is women at conferences. I can tell you personally, someone that we probably all know leaned over to me. He was chair of the panel and said, "Stephanie, we're running out of time. Why don't we just skip you?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "Well, the audience is kind of bored right now. I don't know if they're going to want to hear you or not." And yeah, that was pretty bad. And I happen to be very good at giving presentations. And I said, "Don't worry, I think I can handle it." And then the audience was clearly very interested in what I had to say. And he was absolutely surprised. Perhaps this was in Europe, this was a European, it was a Brit, I'll say that. And maybe just surprised that an American could captivate an audience. And then finally, another issue is children and family. It's the double burden that we've talked about. You know, if you've studied feminism, people talk about all the time. And although academia has been especially flexible for me as a career and as a mother, it's still a problem in terms of spousal hires. It's very difficult to find a job in general, let alone if you're an academic couple in the same place. Even if your husband isn't an academic, if they have a job in, let's say, a big city like Boston or New York, even if there are lots of universities there, the chances of being able to find a tenure track job are really quite slim, simply because there's so many people in the same boat as you. And if you wind up in a place like Wyoming, even if it's a very pleasant place to be, there aren't a lot of job opportunities for your spouse. And so these cause complications in so many different ways when it comes to being a woman in academia. Fed?
Quite to the point. And meanwhile, we got Costanza Hermanin also joined us. She is a researcher, a fellow at the EY. She's at the School of Transnational Governance. She went back to her alma mater. So here we are in a bit of a little EUI mafia. Thank you for joining us, Costanza, as well.
Thank you for having me.
I hope your niece thing went well. And Angela, you want to go next and put in some ideas on the table, and then we can have a nice Costanza, and then have a nice discussion.
Sure. Well, as Federiga was saying, I work at the European Research Council, heading the scientific department here. So we are more on the side of funding the researchers who apply for proposals, by the way, totally in a bottom-up way, no strings attached, no conditions, just good quality research and pushing this cold frontiers of science. Now, what has been observed over time was that first of all there were clearly fewer women applying than men. And this was across the three scientific domains. We cover all domains: physical sciences and engineering, life sciences, and social sciences and humanities. Tendentially, there are more applicants in social sciences and humanities than in physics, engineering, or life sciences. But what is also interesting is the success rate. There were fewer women applying, and also their success rate was lower than men. So there was a consideration. The Scientific Council, which establishes the strategy for the European Research Council, did establish a working group on gender issues, and some measures were taken. One of the measures was that we have different types of grants, starting grants for the younger people after 2 years of PhD, consolidator after 7 years of PhD, and advanced grantees, 10 years of track record, more senior, and so on. So what was done is that women who have children can get maternity leaves of 18 months, and this extends their eligibility. For example, they can count 2 to 7 years after PhD plus 18 months, or 7 to 12 years after PhD plus 18 months. And these kind of measures, plus, of course, a lot of communication and so on, seems to have improved the number of applications. They are very different across domains, but still we had an increase. In terms of success rate, so this is more from the point of view of the applicants. Then the issue of the success rate, which of course has to do with the quality of the applicants, but also the peer review. And we all know from the literature there are biases in peer review, including gender biases in peer review. So then the work has been to brief our evaluators, train our scientific officers who are how to say, preparing the evaluation and working with the chairs on unconscious bias, so that both during the remote phase when they read the proposal and especially during the interviews, where the kind of things like appearances, looking more or less assertive, and these kind of things might be more apparent. And it seems that this also had some good impacts. Then, of course, there is COVID. Now, COVID, we have literature and the data that show that COVID had different impacts on different kind of people across income, generation, gender, and a number of areas. So one of the things that was done was to grant basically automatically extensions to people who had a running grant, which is for 5 years, for example. And they would say, well, we cannot access the laboratory or the field work, or we have to take care of our, family and things, and we cannot get things done and so on. And they got basically an automatic extension that can be 6 months or 1 year, or even later, longer if necessary. So all those things were taken on board. We have, however, certain kind of it's not linear. I mean, we saw clearly, an improve across both the application and the success rate. We had even a couple of years where in some grants, in some fields, the success rate of women was even higher than men. For example, in physical sciences and engineering, they have the lowest number of applicants, but the success rate was even higher than men. So clearly something was about the quality of the application. The application also depend on the size of the research community overall, of course, but also has to do with our bias control and peer review. And the field where, interestingly, and we are trying to analyze why, where there are even recently drops in either applications, well, in application, but also in success rate, is life sciences. So we are trying to understand what's happening in that community, because we know there are a lot of women in life science communities, but something apparently happens in terms of either excessive pre-screening or ways of handling the reviews. So we are studying that. So these are all kind of issues that we are trying to deal with and analyze. And while we speak, there are a number of other debates in the gender working group of the Scientific Council and the agency. The working group itself was renamed into Gender and Diversity Issues Working Group. So there is, of course, an analysis of cross-sectionality about the kind of things that can unfavor or disfavor, I don't know which term is correct, women and people in different contexts. So this is a work which is very much in progress. And as you know, the diversity of Europe is such that certain things, for example, statistics in relation to ethnicity are simply forbidden in some countries for very good and understandable reason. Data protection regulation are, of course, and importantly, very strict. So, for example, we introduced in the application the possibility for people to declare whether they are women, men, or didn't want to declare or declare themselves binary. But this is something, for example, we cannot then publicly report in statistics because we have very few cases and we cannot allow the recognition of somebody through the small numbers. So we are doing differentiated things. We have global statistics, including non-binary, and more detailed statistics, for example, for the different scientific panels, only with the two genders until things might balance out differently and data protection can be protected while accounting also for this diversity. So I think it's all for now. It's a lot of things going on, definitely.
That is pretty amazing, the work you've been doing at ERC, I have to say. Congratulations for that. And I'm sure you were behind the whole thing, the driving force. All right, Costanza, up to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Angela, because having this insider view and also granular and not so granular data about the gender imbalances in grants application is already very interesting. So the first thought that I would like to share is that looking around me and within my university, gender equality in academia has not improved at all. Rather, it has inequalities have increased to the extent that when I started, there were many women professors and women heads of something, administrative departments or academic departments, whereas now that number is lower. I was especially surprised not only by the UI, but also by Bocconi University, one of the most internationalized universities in Italy, announcing yesterday 9 new chairs of department and only having one woman among the 9 chairs. This status of women in academia, we know, as Angela was pointing out, that COVID has been an important factor in determining that career progressions have slowed down, and also the ERC has put efforts into that. I'm afraid academic journals and other departments haven't done so to the same extent. So the world of academia in this sense is just reflecting what has happened all over the world with COVID. The fact that recession is not rather a recession, but is a she-cession, meaning that most women, among those who lost their work, in Italy, the calculation is that 70% of jobs that have gone lost during COVID were women jobs. And probably academia is not different in that regard, to the extent that care giving roles are still very much gendered, also among academics, maybe to a lesser extent, and yet this is what we see. A second remark I have is that although the structure of hierarchy doesn't seem to have improved a lot, there has been an improvement, to the least in the social sciences, in terms of horizontal segregation, gender-based horizontal segregation, meaning that for a number of years, I guess for a long time, women have been researching certain topics, especially rather than others. For instance, there were very few women in war studies and in international affairs, much less than in comparative politics or EU studies. There has also been, I think, traditionally, a horizontal methodological segregation, meaning that until recently, women were kind of expected and frequently did use more qualitative methods than quantitative ones, which is to some extent a dynamic that parallels what is usually known about STEM and women participation and studies in STEM from a methodological point of view. After COVID, and I think the ERC experience shows that as well, there has been in Europe, which is the place I know best and the political environment that I study, there has been an exceptional attention to gender equality. And this is exactly because COVID has caused a recession, and obviously revenues, income, and fiscal contribution for women from women have gone down to an unprecedented extent. And there are two things that have been done at the EU level, which I think can help, but are not yet helping the situation of women in academia directly. And here I'm pointing at the requirements of having gender equality plans within academic and research institution, which has been a necessary, not negotiable condition in order to apply to EU funds. It wasn't the case for Horizon Europe, at least. It wasn't the case before. Before there was a sort of incentive mechanisms vis-a-vis equality plans. Now it is an imperative. And actually, all academic and research institutions have been running after gender equality plans for the past, I think, year and a half. And this is good on the one hand, because the research and academic institutions need to start counting. On the other hand, I think there is a lot of pink dressing in this gender equality plans that have been adopted. And thus I think that from the point of view of methodology, also, and especially within academic and research institutions, there should be a very strong focus on disaggregated data collection, but especially on gender budgeting. Gender equality within research institution cannot only be measured by looking at the number of people in department chair position, presidential positions, and stuff like that. It can and should be assessed also through what the ERC does, but other academic institutions don't do, in terms of who is bringing grants, but also on what topics grants are being spent, and whether those topics have an impact on understanding gender inequalities within society. Is this framework of input, output, outcome that is typical of the gender budgeting methodology? And And here I repeat myself, I really think that as research institutions, we should really use these methodologies that are nowadays very advanced, not only in Canada, but also in European states, in order to understand what our research produces in order to bridge gender equality, and to what extent rules within academia are linked to what kind of research and the amount of funding that is brought or that is given by an academic institution. So this is just my advocacy campaign for counting, but counting beyond heads when we talk about gender equality. Obviously, counting beyond heads faces the very important and yet so far unsurmountable issue that Angela was pointing out when it comes to race and ethnicity and racial and ethnic equality, meaning that if you count genders, you can only count 2 genders so far, whereas our next generation wants us to count more genders than 2. But I think that already starting counting 2 well would be a nice first step. There is the last point I wanted to raise, which is the absolute need for unconscious bias training. This is an exception, it's not a rule within academic institutions, whereas academic institutions should implement this even more so that letters of reference are so important for academic posts. And letters of reference tend to be extremely gendered, also because professors and high-level academics frequently are white males, and they tend to write letters of reference with different terminologies. Studies show for male and female applicants. And another point which I think is very important is not only training evaluators and training evaluators to assess letters of reference, that's very important, and training evaluators to assess application. But I guess that one very important steps, and I have to admit my ignorance because I don't know to what extent ERC does it already or not. There is a part which is about disclaimers for applicants, where we try to raise awareness with them concerning gendered language that they may use for themselves. This is an activity that can be implemented. I think even short video training can be more effective. I mean, I have to undergo video training when I do the selection for Fulbright, and I study these things, so I think I could be very, very critical of how they do the video training, but it's a good training. I mean, I think it works. It really stresses some points which can open the eyes of many people. And the last thing which I want to conclude on is that raising the awareness of applicants themselves is something that can be done through a training or a disclaimer. But I think that within academia, and given the selection processes we have for grants, professorial positions, etc., the role of mentoring is very important. Having women mentors who can tell people how they tend to describe themselves, how imposter syndrome works, and how in our application, selection of topics, etc., we tend to reproduce certain dynamics is important. So this is something I try to do myself. It takes a lot of time, but I guess it can be a game changer when we talk about women in academia. Yeah, so this is what I wanted to share. And thanks, Federiga, because I think that the discussion is extremely interesting on this topic.
Thank you, all of you. We actually have the first question from the audience, so we'll start from there, though I have a question for each of you. And this is anonymous attendee. Costanza mentioned a video training. Could she elaborate, please?
Yes, absolutely. So for people involved or by Fulbright in the assessment of the application for Fulbright grants, and I'm one of those. There are other, I'm an alumna, and other alumni are requested to do this. In order to access the files of the application, we first have to take I think it's a 15 to 20 minutes video training on unconscious biases. The training mainly addresses gender biases. Also because we don't see any picture of the trainees, so it's less important to address racial and ethnic biases in that context. And but I think that short training we are provided with is of extremely good quality.
Wonder before I know that Stephanie is also one of the evaluators, has been one of the evaluators with Fulbright. So I'm curious to know if the same happens on the American side, but also for instance, I did a whole certificate at Stanford on DEI, diversity, equity, and equity, and inclusiveness, and we had a whole module on hidden biases, and the whole module to me was interesting because you had first a self-evaluation, and then the whole module was just on the color of the skin, which was not one of my biases, being European in origin. So to me, it was like, come on, man, I have other kinds of biases. So it would be interesting to know if the biases that are addressed are the same on both sides of the Atlantic with the Fulbright or with other programs. But for me, it was striking because, you know, first you do a self-evaluation, and then anyway, the training is the same for everyone. Steph, you want to come in?
Sure. I'm afraid I can't help you with the Fulbright because I did it while I was in Korea. So I was part of the Korea Fulbright Selection Committee, and that was in 1999. So considering that was back in the last millennium, right? I don't have good information for you, but I would like to talk a little bit about bias, not just gender, but race bias. There's a big issue as to whether the Europeans are doing it right by not counting. And I understand the logic, but from what I understand, most minority groups, immigrant groups say that if you don't count, you can't have any data. And so you really need to. And when I speak to my colleagues here who are women of color, they have so many more issues that they have to deal with. And then in terms of bias and subconscious bias, just a few things to think about. Malcolm Gladwell's mother, if you're familiar with the author, is a Black Jamaican woman, and it turns out that there's so much bias against Blacks that he had bias, even though his mother was. And they've done lots of tests this way in terms of psychology, and people may not realize it. He was shocked that he had this bias, considering that he loved his mother very much, had a good relationship with her, was half Black. But there's a lot of this issue, and part of the problem with my colleagues of color is that students don't think they are that they know their subject matter. There is this bias that they're just that they're not competent in their field. I find, you know, there's so many interesting biases. I'll give you another example. We have a white man who was born in Britain, so you think no problem there. And he's also, he's a naturalized Australian, and he is our Australian Fulbright scholar, and he happens to be an Americanist. So he studies US politics, the presidency. And I was talking to my associate dean, who is a white woman and a professor of psychology. And she said, how ironic that an Australian could teach about American politics. And I said, well, is it ironic that as an American, I can teach European politics? And she's like, well, I've never even thought about that before. And I said, yes, if you can study psychology, I can study the European Union, and an Australian can study the United States. But even that was considered that only people who are from the country could possibly know anything about the country. And so there's so many interesting biases this way. And another one that I was dealing with, my white engineering, male engineering colleague said that it was important to get rid of social work as a discipline at the University of Wyoming because it was useless. And I said, are you saying that perhaps because it's associated with women and poor people? And he couldn't even consider anything like that. But basically any prestigious discipline, we were looking to make budget cuts. Any prestigious discipline that was associated with men and high salaries was considered important, and anything that wasn't. So, for example, African American studies, these were things that people said, yeah, let's just get rid of. So there's so many different kinds of biases this way. I think the training is a terrific first step just to make people aware. And I think it has helped with women. If you look at women, you know, even from 20 years ago, I think they're in a better place than they were then. I think there are more women, for example. We're having, you know, a webinar like this. I remember that Costanza Hermanin, she said about 20 years ago, she said that Europe was 10 years behind the United States when it came to women's rights, and Germany was 10 years behind Europe. That was, maybe you're aware that in Germany, you didn't have school lunches. And the idea was that children would go home to their mothers and eat a hot lunch there. This meant that women couldn't work. It's perhaps not a surprise that Germany has one of the lowest birth rates when you consider policies like that. Now, these things have changed, but I say it because I'm actually optimistic that by counting and discussing these issues, that progress can be made.
Angela, I see you are doing a funny face. You want to come in? And to the people following us from remote, please come in with questions and write it in the chat. No, we can hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes. So no, the face was meant to be, how to say, in solidarity with some of the comments that were made, of course, with regard to all those different elements. Well, one thing that we noticed, for example, in terms of biases, first of all, yes, there is a recorded training that evaluators are expected to listen to before they start evaluating, and it's also part of our briefing. It's something that was how to say, imported from one of the national research councils in Europe. It's actually more about hiring than evaluation itself, but at least it deals with biases. And then there was a long discussion in the council on whether to do a new ERC-made bias control video or to take stock, and they analyzed NSF, Royal Society, and a lot of things. And we didn't find the perfect one, so to say. So we are still using the one that we started with, but there is more work clearly going on. And with regard to the point that Stephanie was making about valuing different areas of science, it's very interesting because there are, it's difficult to see what is, if you like, the key factor in what is valued in science. You were making the point about social services. Is this something which is maybe related to women or poor people? There are cases where the attack is very explicit. I mean, there are countries where women's studies and migration and refugee studies have been taken out. One of them is Hungary. I mean, I don't need to go to Russia. So this is something that has been happening. There have been discussions, protests, and so on. But this was part of broader issue about freedom in academia. As you surely know, one important academic institution had to close its headquarters, Central European University, while it kept a little antenna. So the question is this an attack on freedom of academia, starting with some areas of academia and scholarship that are considered more, whatever, critical or difficult, or dealing with certain vulnerable groups? Difficult to say. There have been issues with historians, with anthropologists, I mean, you name it. In other countries, we know, for example, that climate scientists have been under attack because of, climate skepticism. So that's actually quite an interesting area. I'm not aware of studies where there is, how to say, a comprehensive analysis of what is valued as a scientific discipline in terms of being, scientific valuable, and whether this is connected with the gender or other issues in society, in terms of reputation and so on, or whether this is correlated with different, let's say, degrees and an extent of freedom of academia. So I think this is actually another important area. When you were speaking, for example, about, Federiga was saying, well, I got an all bias about bias basically towards Black people, if I understood you well, Federiga, and you were saying, well, that's not one of where
No,
I need.
I didn't have.
You didn't have, so
Yeah,
they
I didn't
assumed
have.
that you
So,
were not having any bias in that regard. I didn't get
no,
the
no,
point.
we self-evaluated. That was interesting for me because
Okay.
so the certificate was a whole certificate done online, right? And we had this whole module which was on hidden biases, right? So at the beginning of the module, we had a test where we self-evaluated. And my biases are very weird. I can tell you what they are, but very weird. And so I'm zero biased on the color of the skin.
Okay.
Probably because I'm Italian, right? Our skin color is different to begin with. But then, regardless of what the result of the test was, the whole module was on how to fight hidden biases against the color of the skin, which led me, I mean, this is done by Stanford, so it's mainly taken by Americans, but led me to infer that most people either they just assume that everybody had that biased or the majority had that biased. But for me, it was just interesting because it just assumed that everybody's first bias was the color of the skin, which clearly wasn't my case, but I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be in your cases either, right? Probably because of our upbringing, which is completely different from an American point of view. So for me, it was like, oh, I need to learn how to fight other biases. How do I do that?
Okay. Well, because I think this is, of course, also very related indeed to our, societies and history and perceptions as well. Because I was thinking again that when we speak, for example, about biases in education, we have even some projects funded by ERC where it's quite clear that a big bias is not so much about the color of the screen, but is first, second, or even third generation migrants. And they might be by now, wherever they come from can be the same color or a different color of skin, but they are still disadvantaged by being first or second, or even in some cases third generation migrants. So it's very interesting to try to detect indeed when there are a clear discrimination happening through education, through income, jobs, and so on, and whether that also connect with biases in the way we see things, including in the academic work. So this was just to say there is a lot of work to be done on intersectionality, and I think one of the risks sometimes might be to think, as you were saying correctly, Federiga and Stephanie, that we might have the same biases, but actually probably not, which doesn't mean everything goes and everything is relative, but that we need to be also evidence-based about what are the biases which are potentially stronger in certain contexts and how to deal with that. And for example, for ERC, which is it's a European research program, meaning that applicants can come from any part of the world, but they have to be in a host institution in the European Union or countries associated to the European research program, and spend at least part of the time here in Europe and associated countries for their research, but they can come from any part of the world, and our evaluators are clearly coming from any part of the world. So for example, speaking about biases, we need to be also aware, which is not easy, of, are we taking this training and this discussion at the level that we need when we consider that they can come with very different backgrounds or levels of sensitivities. And sometimes they are reporting to us saying, well, we found it interesting or concerning or whatever, that this has been tackled very well, but these other aspects has not been tackled very well. So that's quite an interesting work that we all have to do, I guess.
I'd like to just to say a couple of things. There's been a lot of research on I guess, areas that are associated with women as opposed to men. And so if you talk about social science, that's seen as a soft science, whereas physics and engineering are seen as hard sciences. And so some feminist scholars will talk about the idea of being hard or soft, if you see where I'm going, and which are considered good and valuable. And I have a document I don't think my European friends have from Oklahoma State University, which gives you the average salaries of every single academic field in the United States according to region, and whether you're an R1 university or R2, and hard fields are better paid. Even for international relations and international security, that gives you more than twice the salary of a political scientist, and that's even more than a sociologist. I'm not sure why sociologists are so poorly paid, but they are the worst paid. And social workers are very poorly paid, those who teach MSW and those positions. And that's really a fascinating thing. There seems to be just a prejudice against, a bias against anything that's associated with women or minorities, just in general. At least that's some of the research that's come out of the US.
And again, I would like to invite people to ask questions online. Just wanted to react to what Costanza Steinhauser said. I tend to disagree with her. It's true that high school kids go back home in many places in Europe, but it's also true that in Europe we have free education from when kids are very young, which doesn't exist in the US. So, I mean, I frankly, before living in the US, I thought as well that the US were more progressed when it comes to women's rights. After all these years, I came to the opposite conclusions, that there is a lot of talk, probably more than there is in Europe, but at the end of the day, in substantial terms, in Europe, we are probably more advanced than in the US. And education is definitely one of the reasons why Europe is more advanced. And from an anecdotal point of view, I taught in both continents, and all my American female students, I mean, the most important thing in their field is when they get married, and they all change their damn name. And I'm like, why are you changing your name? Which in academia is a major thing. You change your name and it's a problem, right? Because you have name recognition. And really, they all change their names and they're like, yeah, I get you married. I'm like,
I don't know anyone who's changed their name. I'm like, who are you hanging out with?
I do know people who changed their name. Yeah, absolutely. It also happens in France, though, Federiga. It really depends. I wanted to add a few points. From the point of view of evidence and data that I know, from the Global Gender Gap Report and a recent study of Reuters on women CEO in financial institutions, the US are presently doing better than Europe, at least limited to these fields, economic empowerment in terms of senior level private company positions, not in general terms, not the medium class or low wage families. So that's interesting, I think. The second point I had is related to what I think, Stephanie, you mentioned it. I think we should really address this issue of being reluctant to count. I think there is a lot of self-restraint when it comes to inequalities, thinking that some issues are too private to be addressed, issues related to gender, sexual orientation, issues related to race, especially, because when you talk with individuals who are part of groups at risk of discrimination, be it racial discrimination, discrimination on ground of sexual orientation, disability-based discrimination, they don't fear being counted. It's rather fear that discrimination against them isn't counted that haunts them. So there is this complete disconnect in between, at least in my experience. I worked a bit on that. Well, I worked several years on this. There is a lot of disconnect in between the public institutions, statisticians, and people who believe that out of privacy concern, there are data we shouldn't collect, and people who are the holder of those data who would like to be counted to some extent. And obviously there are cautions to be taken, but collecting anonymous data with, categories that are accepted by the communities that need to be counted, be them racial categories or categories in terms of gender identity and stuff like that, something we should really start to be doing. Otherwise, I don't think we can really address many issues we have in society, but we don't see because we all are a little bit biased to some extent. And then I had the last point, which I cannot find anymore. So Federiga, tell me if there are other questions.
No, then we have, then if you don't have other points, we have, and it's 6:30, so we need to start wrapping up. But we have two questions from the audience, whoever wants to answer. One is, I wonder if the speakers would be able to reflect on how women academics, especially women of color, might navigate this system. What advice would they give? And then in the same line, is there any particular age that women academics are particularly at disadvantage? It sounds as if certain disciplines are also disadvantaged. Who wants to come in?
I can start. Sorry, Costanza, you want to go first?
No, the very last point, which is what I forgot before. Certainly there are disciplines that are considered more important and better paid. The discipline, together with sociology, that is certainly considered not so important and is not well paid is gender studies. That for sure, absolutely the case. And it's not only in academia though, it's also, if you look at politics, politicians who engage in advocating for gender equality are usually not considered the most important ones, or rather the most important ones don't engage in this kind of campaigns. Just
And yeah, that's a very important point. And so I would give the word to Angela and then Stephanie to answer the two questions, and then I think it's time to wrap up. Yep.
Okay, yes, indeed. I'll need to leave soon. Well, with regard to the second question, at least when it comes to data we can observe at the European Research Council, clearly the problem is more in the advanced grant track record, meaning the senior. So it seems there is hope, meaning in the younger generation. I repeat, 2 to 7 years after PhD and 7 to 12 years after PhD. Definitely there are more women applicants, and also the success rate is quite okay. But as I said, and here we come to the areas, for some reason that we are still trying to understand, there are some areas in life sciences. So we were speaking about hard and soft sciences, and life sciences might be regarded as something in between. I don't know, because they are living, but at the same time, of course, they are very much linked with the measurements and modeling and so on. So it depends on what is the definition of hard and soft, of course. But it's very difficult to understand why there are this kind of drops and going better and going down in that particular field. So we're trying to understand in a more disaggregated way what's happening in that field, which ranges, from epidemiology to genomics to ecology to, and so on and so forth, DNA sequencing and all the rest. In physics, mathematics and engineering, the field where there are fewer women is clearly mathematics, followed by engineering and then physics. In physics, there is clearly more women in applied physics than in theoretical physics. So there are, and the question is this coming because of gender bias in academia, that is in the teaching of the discipline, or is coming in the scientific fields? Computer science is also an area which is, of course, extremely important with everything which is happening about biases in artificial intelligence. As we all know, machine learning is very much based in learning, including the stupidities and the biases of humans. So a lot of things associated with machine learning and artificial intelligence tend to reproduce biases and expand biases because they were there before and they continue to be there. As you know, there have been studies about the use of certain algorithm in employment decision and others. So this is something that is being researched by some of our grantees, and that we are trying to understand, for example, when we use certain limited aspects of artificial intelligence, for example, in the identification of reviewers, but the choice is made by humans all the time. So there are quite a number. In social sciences and humanities, frankly, we see in our panels, for example, fewer women in economics, which might be related also to the point of Costanza, not about economics as a discipline, but eventually the whole area of economics more broadly. While we definitely have no, how to say, big difference, I must say, there are applicants in basically all other areas of social sciences and humanities, whether it is history or archaeology or sociology or anthropology or others. We will need, I mean, more disaggregated analysis to know, but I must say, of course, you did identify, and I also mentioned and agree with you, Costanza, for example, about gender studies as being less valued than others. But if I compare with other fields, clearly in social sciences and humanities, there is less, how to say, at least evident bias in terms of less women applying or working in the field or having a lower success rate than it happens in life sciences and in some areas of mathematics, physics, and engineering. which doesn't mean we can be complacent about social sciences and humanities, but it's just an indicator. And for the first question about what would be the guidance, well, difficult to say because it's really also very context dependent, but I think that finding good mentors to help out in figuring out the system, whether it is a university, whether it is a funding agency, whether it is in Europe or in the US or in Australia or South Africa or Singapore or whatever it is, it's probably something which can be indeed quite helpful, because general comments, I'm sure this webinar can help possibly with some hints, but then I think it's very important to find mentors who can help in the specific circumstances. That would be just a little piece of advice I would suggest.
Yeah, and to second Angela, before I give it to Stephanie for the last words, I would strongly encourage young women in academia to apply for grants, which in my non-statistical significant empirical experience, they tend not to do, especially untenured scholars. They're so stressed about what they need to do for tenure that they don't apply for grants. And actually, frankly, the ability to get grants is what allowed me to have a tenure position in Rome. I mean, I got grants, I did things, I got noticed, and I got the tenure position. If I had not, without Erasmus Plus, I would have never been a professor in Italy. That's pretty clear to me, and I think the same goes for a huge amount of people. Though I have to agree with Costanza that the gender is in evaluation. I'm also an evaluator for Erasmus Plus, and every time there is a project that is focused on gender and you have a male evaluator, every single time the evaluator is like, oh, it's not demonstrated that there is a gender gap in there. Yeah, it's pretty hard. I would stop here and give it to Stephanie for the last advice, and maybe we will wrap up. Steph.
Sure, thank you. So there's been a lot of research done, or not a lot, some research done on parents versus women. And it seems that women who don't have children, they have fewer problems getting promoted. And parents, so even fathers, right, who are taking care of children, they have more obstacles to getting promoted. So an interesting thought may be that it's not so much gender bias as parent bias, because they have other obligations. So one of the questions was, what's the most vulnerable time for women in the United States? And this is specific to the United States because of our very messed up healthcare system, if I can dare say that, is you don't get health insurance until you get your first job. And if you're at a graduate school, you do get insurance, but it's often not as good. And women's insurance costs more because they are of childbearing age at that time. And so I can say that many women like me waited till I got my first job until I got pregnant. And that's a terrible time to get pregnant, because you have 6 years to get tenure. And so this is a woman's most likely her childbearing years. When I gave birth at the age of 31, that was considered a geriatric pregnancy. Today, that's considered less so, but you still get the idea. And this is the time when women are supposed to publish or perish, as well as do extra service and prove that they are dedicated. I can say that most of my colleagues here work 50-hour weeks, not 40-hour weeks. I try to protect my younger faculty, and I'm very conscious of protecting my new parents. But that's when women don't get tenure. And if you look at the statistics, you have more women who are starting out as assistant professors. They don't get tenure. You have fewer women who are then tenured. You have fewer full professors, and you have fewer women who are administrators. And so it's this crucial time in terms of the pipeline that really coincides with women's childbearing years, that shows that way fewer women as presidents of universities, for example. So there is bias. There's also pipeline issues because of fertility.
Obviously, the question of when to do a child in academia, it's majorly important. And then it also depends on the system, right? In which part of the world you are an academic, right? For instance, in the Italian case is different than theirs. We have to pass, at least in my time, we had to pass the written exam. And I remember my written exam was scheduled 3 months after the birth of my son. And having had no kids before, I thought, oh, I've been studying before, a piece of cake. And then my son was born, and I was like, my brain wouldn't even connect. And I was like, I'm never gonna make this. And then I received the call and said, oh, we're very sorry to tell you that one of the members of the committee is gravely ill. We have to postpone it to the summer. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, yes. So if you want to have kids in academia, it really depends on the system. In the US, it's much more stressful because you have a clock ticking.
Yeah.
And in the Nordic countries, lots of people do kids while they go to school. You know, at the UI, at there was at a certain point that there were more kids than PhD thesis defended, because it's a relatively good time to have a child, right? You have a stipend for 4 years, which now it's 4 years for everyone. So, you know, you don't have much to do apart from writing. And so it really depends on the system you're in. But in our research across different sectors, one thing we found is that partner is fundamental. So if you have a family, choose wisely your partner. Is your partner going to support it or not?
Sorry, one last thing. I think people are better off in Europe than in the United States, and I think it's because there's so many more social safety networks and more support for this sort of thing, and maternity leave. And until the United States has better healthcare and maternity leave, I think we're going to be behind.
Thank you. All right, it's 6:45. Thank you very much. Thank you for sticking with us from home. Have a great, thank you for the panel and your comment, a very insightful session. Thank you so much Rachel for following us, and have a wonderful long weekend if you are in Europe, or a Halloween weekend if you are in the US. And thank you everybody for your help. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.